Okay, thanks everyone for attending. It's the top of the hour, and so we will go ahead and get started with our July webinar on Windows 7, Server 2008, and SQL 2008 End of Life. So just a little bit about Community IT before we get started. Community IT was founded in 1993, and we've had an exclusive focus on helping nonprofits advance their mission through the effective use of technology. Community IT is also a 100% employee-owned company. We've also been recognized as a top MSP nationally by Channel Futures magazine. So we're pleased to have that and got the new logo up here for their 2018 award winners. My name is Matthew Eshleman. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Community IT. I actually started about 19 years ago, just about this week, as an intern. And after finishing up my internship here, finishing my degrees in computer science and computer information systems, have come back to Community IT and been a part of the team ever since. So really enjoy the colleagues I get to work with and all the wonderful clients that we get to serve, and it's a great combination. So I'm happy to be able to talk with you today about this topic. And so let's go ahead and look at the agenda for what we're going to cover during today's session. So we are going to talk about what is end of life and when. We'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek into the computer environment that we manage at Community IT. So Community IT is a managed service provider with, as I said, a focus on nonprofit technology. We support about 150 organizations, and that represents about 4,500 managed endpoints. So we'll get to look at some of the numbers for our managed installation base, and you can perhaps compare it to your own. Then we'll look at those three different areas that were identified in the subject line. We'll look at the approach to handling workstations that are running Windows 7. We'll talk about some approaches to handling Microsoft SQL 2008, and then also approach to handling Server 2008 as well. We'll also talk a little bit about just kind of in general steps to secure your organization kind of regardless, and then we'll kind of wrap up as well. So as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to all the registrants after we finish up today, and the slides will be posted in our SlideShare channel after the webinar. I'll go ahead and chat that link out now. We will have time for questions at the end, but if you think of something as I'm going along, feel free to go ahead and kind of ask those questions as we go. I am running solo today, so I'll be trying to juggle the presentation and also looking at the questions. So we may end up addressing most of the questions at the end of the presentation today. So thanks for your attention and engagement, and hope that we cover some ground that is useful. All right, so as we can see here, the support for Windows Server and SQL Server is fast approaching. And in fact, in the case for SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2, that support has actually already ended. So that ended July 9th, and extended support for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 ends January 14th of 2020. So about a little less than 6 months from now, that's platform will be out of date. That's also Windows 7 is going to be in that bucket as well. So as a slide here from Microsoft indicates, means Microsoft is no longer going to release security updates for those platforms. And as such, because security updates will not be released for the platform, it could mean that's going to expose you to additional security attacks and potentially compliant risks with regulations such as GDPR, which would mandate that the operating systems of the environments that you are running are supported and up to date. So it's a pretty significant, decision or impact of Microsoft to go ahead and end support for these platforms, and it's something that we need to pay attention to as IT professionals and address accordingly. So let's take a look at the environment at Community IT. So as I mentioned Community IT manages about 4,500. Thanks. I got a note here. We'll get the slides advancing here. Community IT manages about 4,500 endpoints, and as part of those, 4,500 endpoints, the predominant number are server or our workstations, and so this represents just in percentages the distribution actually of servers that we have here at Community IT. So you can see the largest number, actually we have about 49% are running server 2012. We've got about 33%, the yellow are running Windows 2016. And then we've got about 19% that are still running Windows 2008 or Windows 2008 R2. So you can see we've still got a fairly big chunk at Community IT of servers that we need to go ahead and plan to get offboarded or migrated here in the next 6 months or so. So whenever we take a look at the workstations, again, you can see that we've done maybe a better job of getting systems transitioned into Windows 10. So that represents the vast majority of the system. So we got about 82% of our managed systems are on Windows 10, with about 16% being the Windows 7 version. Oddly enough, we still have a couple of hangers on for Windows 8 and 8.1, represents 2% of our managed base. And then I think we actually have one managed computer that is Windows XP. And it's interesting to note that that support actually ended April 8th of 2014. So, and I think we actually last year got rid of our last managed server that was running Windows 2000. So, just because it's end of support doesn't mean that the system is going to turn off and not run, but it does mean that you're not going to get security updates for those systems, which is actually a pretty significant loss. So this is the environment again here at Community IT, and I'm assuming that for the folks here on the webinar, your experience and breakdown may be similar with a couple of Windows 7 machines that are kind of hanging around, and then some of the servers hanging around as well. So what does end of support actually mean? So end of support means you will no longer have access to critical security updates, which is kind of the major issue. So without those regular security updates, it's going to be impossible to guarantee protection against those hackers and malware that exploit vulnerabilities within operating systems themselves. So while you can protect to some degree with anti-malware and other types of software, those kind of bad actors are exploiting vulnerabilities within the operating system, and if there are not security patches against those, then those holes only grow bigger. So without upgrading, you're going to risk losing data, having issues with business applications or performance, and because of weaknesses in that environment. So there's also a stat here that was taken from a cybercrime report from Cybersecurity Ventures in 2016 that said cybercrime were going to cost the world $6 trillion annually, up from $3 trillion that was specified in 2015. So clearly, cybersecurity is a significant cost. I think these numbers just kind of seem to boggle the mind. What we know from our annual cyber, the nonprofit incident report that we just published at the beginning of the year is that, for small and medium-sized businesses, an average security incident is going to have direct costs of around $149,000 to remediate. And having been on the outside of a couple of those situations, I can say that is an accurate number. That's not inflated. So if you're a 200-seat organization, have a cybersecurity breach, you're looking at potentially $100,000 cash loss associated with remediating that. I happen to live in Baltimore, where we are still recovering from a ransomware attack that was essentially caused by unpatched systems that were exploited, and I think the direct cost associated with that is on the order of $18 million. So these costs are significant, and they do happen, and they're often tied to unpatched and vulnerable systems. So with all of that cheery news out of the way, let's talk about those 3 things to know. So end of support is coming, or in the case of SQL 2008, it's actually here. So systems are our security patches are no longer being provided for SQL 2008, and coming up in January of 2020, patches will no longer be provided for Windows 2008 or Windows 7. Interestingly enough, you could get 3 more years of support if you migrate those workloads to Azure. And I will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, but Microsoft is going to continue, obviously, to develop on the platform and provide security updates, but only if those workloads are hosted in Azure, be that through a managed database instance for 2008, or if you migrate the full server of Windows 2008 or 2008 R2 into Azure, they will continue to provide security patches for those operating systems through 2023. And then finally, our general recommendation is going to be replace systems. So we would tend to not recommend to upgrade. We would recommend, when necessarily, to replace with new hardware or potentially migrate into a services platform, as opposed to, maintaining or even trying to do an upgrade of an existing system. So let's talk a little bit about workstations. So for Windows 7, that support is ending on that date in January. And while an in-place upgrade is possible, it is no longer free. So you may recall that Microsoft did provide a free upgrade to Windows 10. That actually free upgrade happened all the way back, or expired all the way back in 2016, actually July 29th of 2016. There are some reports that it still works, maybe. However, it's not an officially sanctioned process, and our assumption is that if you're thinking of upgrading to Windows 10 at this point, you'd probably be better off, making that transition into a new computer instead. For a point of reference, the upgrade costs are going to be $16 per seat to go to Windows 10 Enterprise. That's through TechSoup, so that is the donation fee. So that would cover about 50 licenses of Windows 10 Enterprise through TechSoup. If you exhaust that, then there is a discounted available through TechSoup, and that's $87. And then if you do not qualify for TechSoup donations, maybe you're not a 501c3, maybe you're a C4 or a C6, then your options are then to go kind of on the retail side, where you can get upgrades to Windows 10 Pro for about $60 from CDW or Dell or kind of those vendors, or you can kind of buy from the Microsoft store for $190. So again, so the price to upgrade is not insignificant. So I would take a look at the kind of the overall total cost of ownership whenever you're looking at doing those upgrades. So typically our computer replacement time frame is going to be on a 3 to 4 year schedule. Kind of shading to the 3 years for laptops, maybe 4 years on desktops. And so when you look at kind of the cost and time associated of upgrading a system, that really should be replaced every 3 to 4 years, I think you become a lot better off if you can make that investment in new technology, a new hardware that's going to have a longer life than, potentially upgrading hardware that's already, 3 or 4 or 5 years old at this point. So again, if there's any questions, go ahead and chat them in, and we'll pick them up here as we go along. And And as I said before, the recommendation really is to look at the total cost of ownership and kind of see if we can make that investment in a new computer, into new hardware. Our experience has been that Windows 10 in general is a really reliable and robust operating system, and it also provides very tight integration with Office 365. That's been our experience, is that most of the nonprofit clients that we work with are choosing to go with Office 365. There are still a number of organizations that are going with G Suite or other providers, but the predominant selection is with Office 365, and there's just a lot of integration capabilities that are built into the platform in terms of OneDrive support, kind of folder syncing, that are really nice to have and that are included. And then the other thing I will say is that Windows 10 has a reliable update mechanism. One of the things that we do, supporting several thousand computers, is we focus a lot on updates, because security vulnerabilities, exploit, weaknesses in platforms that are often patched. We really are focused on updating systems. So when you look at, Windows 2007, something, an operating system that was released over 10 years ago, and had a monthly update cadence where you could selectively install updates. You can imagine the complexity and the fracturing of the install base that happens whenever you've got 120 different update cycles, 10 years, 12 updates a year, that you can install multiple you can pick and choose what you installed. So for better or for worse, Windows 10 was designed to be more consistent in the code base. And so that's why we have these kind of monolithic updates that occur on a monthly basis, and then they're forcing you to do feature updates, every 6 months or once a year, to get to kind of a clean base, so that they can have a much more consistent and unified code base to work with. So minimize the complexity in terms of the updating process. So we've certainly seen that Windows 7 updates or Windows updates is a really fraught process right now. It takes a lot of work to maintain and update and kind of ensure that updates are occurring. So if you can get into Windows 10, you get the benefits of an up-to-date secure platform that's a lot easier to keep up to date. Now, SQL 2008 is something that kind of snuck in here and is already end of life. So that was end of support as of July 9th. Again, migrate or upgrade. I would say upgrade if you can, onto new version. SQL 2012 is still supported, 2016, 2017. The alternate, if for whatever reason the platform that you are running requires SQL 2008, then your option is to kind of run it, on-prem or in your data center as is, maybe paying extra attention to backups and protection of the VMs, or you can migrate that into Azure. So that's the update. Again, and if you do migrate into the Microsoft Cloud, you can get 3 years of security updates at no charge. And again, there's additional features that are built into Azure that can help protect and back up the data. So again, that is kind of the approach to handling SQL 2008. I didn't include it as a separate slide here, but Exchange 2010 is also end of life. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, that Microsoft is, that is reaching that 10-year end of support platform. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll go ahead and just chat out the link to Microsoft's official announcement about the end of support. So go ahead and that link is now in the chat platform. So for SQL, for SQL 2008, for Exchange 2010, I think SharePoint 2010 is in that mix as well. There are no more security patches. Now, before we talk about the server 2008, I did want to discuss a little bit about just kind of security steps that should be completed regardless. And so this would again be if you're running 2008, 2002, 2012. Regardless, these are steps that you should make sure are in place regardless of the operating system version. So the first one is just disable SMB v1. So again, that's there was the Eternal Blue vulnerability exploited a weakness in SMB v1. So that's kind of enabled by default in these operating systems. So the recommendation would be make sure that that is disabled, so you can run SMB v3. That will work just fine in 2008 until you can kind of get migrated. But that's a kind of a big gaping security hole in the network. Perhaps the even larger security hole is public RDP access. So that is, again, terminal servers. So if you have remote access to your servers, there should not be those should not be available publicly. There should be no way that you could get to that directly. If you still need RDP, then that should be protected either by a VPN in front of it. So users VPN, then they can connect to RDP, or by using a remote desktop server gateway, so you can proxy those connections over HTTPS so that you can secure the connection. So native, plain old 3389, or if you're being cute and incrementing the port number, doesn't matter, still using RDP, then that public access needs to be removed. And then finally, I would say that again, I'm beating the drum about patching, ensuring that those systems are up to date on patching is a key piece of your security practice. I know we spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to keep our Server 2008 R2 systems patched. At this point, 2008, it's almost impossible to patch. There's, the Windows update process is essentially broken, and it's very difficult to keep those systems up to date. So, just if you have it set for automatic updates and are assuming it's working, it's most likely not. So you would need to spend some time, just getting in there and making sure that the systems are up to date. All right, so let's go dig into SQL or Server 2008 and 2008 R2. So both of them actually have been supported and will continue to be supported for the next couple of months. So again, end of support, January 2020. Again, do you decommission? Do you migrate? Do you upgrade? Our approach would be, typically to migrate the server to services, and kind of keeping with your organization's IT roadmap. We've been following essentially a cloud-first strategy, where our first priority or first preference is to migrate from a physical on-premise server to a software as a service application. If that's not possible, then looking at some other kind of web or cloud-based application so that we can focus on the effective use of a technology as opposed to the supporting the underlying platform. Again, for your organization, if you need to keep a 2008 R2 or 2008 workload, you may need to migrate that, and one choice would be to migrate it into Azure, where you would be provided with 3 years of security updates as well. So that is an option for you to consider. Just a couple of other things to note. I mean, it's piling on to some of the weaknesses that are in Server 2008, and so some of the things to be aware of whenever you're planning your migrations. And these are some lessons learned that we've accumulated over the years of doing these migrations. One thing is just to note that Server 2008 did not include native TLS 1.2 support. So as TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are deprecated, TLS 1.2 is becoming a requirement, and so that can kind of govern all kinds of things, from how you are securely sending email to how communication is happening from the server to other platforms. So again, I know in our management platform, we're phasing out TLS 1.0 as a way for our agents to check back in, and so TLS 1.2 is going to be required for those agents to check in. And that's going to be, the same case again. If you have other web services, web applications, TLS 1.2 is going to be a requirement, as those other methods are going to be deprecated as well. One kind of lesson learned, a thing to note, is that I think probably Server 2019 is out, and it represents, I think, a modest improvement over Server 2016. And I think a lot of the feature improvements that are occurring are really designed for the large enterprise of large data center. So for, if you're running less than 100 servers, you're probably not going to notice any differences. But one thing to note is that Server 2016 can be joined to a 2008 R2 domain. You can DC promo that. However, in 2019, that same process doesn't work. So domain controllers in 2019 require DFSR as the file replication technology to replicate data in sysvol, as opposed to like earlier servers would support FRS. So you actually cannot do a DC promo of a 2019 server in a 2008 R2 domain before you change the replication technology. It's pretty straightforward. It seems to work fairly well, but you actually would need to change the replication technology that the servers are using before you can DC promo a 2019 domain controller if you've got a 2008 R2 or 2008 domain. If you're still running 2003, you got to do a swing migration where you bring the 2008 server or 2012 server as an interim step, so you can kind of swing the domain up to a higher functional level. So yeah, if anybody else has any kind of lessons learned or things that they found out in kind of doing server migrations, feel free to chat that in. And so thanks for adding the questions here. So now we're going to talk about, all right, so we know all this stuff about when patching is going to end, all the reasons why we should be upgrading or migrating, so okay, so what do we do? So I want to talk a little bit about the option to migrate into Azure. So Azure is Microsoft's cloud platform. It would be the competitor to Amazon Web Services. Those are kind of the two big players. It is appealing for nonprofits because there's an Azure sponsorship that if you're a 501c3 nonprofit, you would most likely qualify for. Again, I can't say with 100% certainty that you would, but in our experience, most 501c3 nonprofit organizations would qualify for a $3,500 annual subscription credit. So you basically go through, you apply for the sponsorship with your Office 365 account. Once that sponsorship is approved, then you would add that subscription into your Azure tenant, and then you can deploy resources against that. So basically, you would just see a $3,500 credit in the account, and then as you deploy resources and run computing, it just draws down on that account, and then whenever the $3,500 is done, then it transitions over to regular billing, and then you just get billed for whatever you use. So with that being said, $3,500 sounds like a lot of money, but it can go quick, especially if you're not 100% sure of how to go about, which servers to provision, some of the other benefits that you can qualify for as a nonprofit. So you really have to know what you're doing whenever you're provisioning these resources. Otherwise, you can get kind of a nasty surprise when it comes to paying the bill, because if you use it, they're going to charge you for it, and it's not very easy, if possible at all, to kind of have Microsoft not charge you for what you use. So just be aware of the pricing. And a couple of things that we've learned, and this is kind of a moving target, is the standard way to buy something is what's called on-demand pricing. That's the most expensive. So you're essentially buying something to use it for an hour. So again, if you're testing something, you need to spin up a server to do some basic tasks. You can actually turn on a server. You can run it for a couple of hours. You can turn off. They'll charge you a couple bucks for it. If you're going to run a server like you would typically run it in your office or your data center, where you're going to deploy the server and it's just going to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, then you're going to get charged for all of that running time, even if the server isn't actually kind of doing anything outside of the 8 to 6 whatever normal business hours that you have. So so be aware of that. So by default, you're going to get charged for on-demand pricing, which is the most expensive. And the one thing that has changed recently is that reserved instance pricing, where you say, hey, we know we're going to run this server for a year, we're going to commit to that. You could save 40% off the price, or if you buy 3 years, that's even more. That is not available to be applied to the sponsorship agreement. So that's something that's new where, a year or two ago, we were able to do that. In recent deployments, sponsorship, we were not able to deploy reserved instances against the sponsorship. So, again, that's, a little bit of the, kind of the downside of the sponsorship is that it's a nice big pot of money, but there are also some things that that you have to be aware of when using the sponsorship. And then finally, on the pricing side, one benefit that nonprofits can take advantage of is the bring your own license or the hybrid licensing approach. So as I mentioned, typically the on-demand pricing is going to include the full licensing for Windows, which is basically corporate prices. And so if you have your own Windows license, you can save about half of what the on-demand price is. So if a server is 70 cents an hour, at regular prices, if you bring your own license, that could be 35 cents an hour. So again, you'll need to buy licensing, from TechSoup or from other charity programs, but you can save a significant amount of money by selecting the hybrid licensing whenever you're checking out. So that's a big lesson learned for us. And now, how do you get into Azure is kind of is a question. And one question somebody asked, if they've got a virtual server, can you migrate that to Azure? And so the answer is yes. And you can migrate to Azure if you've got a physical server, if you're running on Hyper-V, if you're running on VMware, you can actually install an agent, replicate that whole server as it is into Azure using a tool that Microsoft has developed called Azure Site Recovery. So Azure Site Recovery, was essentially designed to be a business continuity solution where you could, install an agent, you could replicate data from on-premise into Azure, you could fail over into Azure, you could fail back to your on-prem systems, given a couple of dependencies. But it's a really powerful tool. What Microsoft is saying here is that, you can basically just use Azure Site Recovery as a way to replicate your existing VM infrastructure or physical server infrastructure into Azure and just run it there. So, in terms of a migration, you would use Azure Site Recovery, set up your Azure environment, replicate into Azure, turn off the recovery, move all the pointers and references into Azure, and, away you go. So, again, you could probably use that process to kind of right size the instance. So while you may have like a gigantic server on-prem, and it's got 32 gigs of RAM and all these processor cores, but maybe it's running at 2 or 3% utilization. Maybe if you replicate in Azure, you can, because you're paying for the size, you would want to scale that down so that you're maybe running 8 gigs of RAM or 16 gigs of RAM. Maybe you're going to scale down the processor core, so instead of 1 or 2% utilization, you're going to run at 50 or 60% utilization as a way to manage some of the costs. So yes, you can replicate servers straight into Azure using Azure Site Recovery. All right. So let me go ahead and actually let me chat out a couple of these links. So the first link here is just the how to migrate into add a 2016 domain controller, and then also chat out the link for the support that Microsoft is including for 3 years in Azure. So, all right. So in terms of the typical network, obviously, the advent of the cloud and the migration of data into cloud services, means that your typical network migration is not like a one-to-one replacement. So again, if you've got, one physical server or one virtual server running, 5 or 6 VMs, if you're going to be replacing that, you're probably not going to replace it with the exact same, because now your email's in the cloud, your database is in the cloud, your files are in the cloud, and so, okay, it's like, what do you still need to actually run on premise? So this is just some general guidance that we see and are kind of aligned around whenever we're thinking about upgrading networks. So again, if you're less than 25 users, it's totally realistic to, get rid of the server and not have anything in the server closet, as they say. That would typically mean that your users are doing Azure AD join, so they're joining their computers to the Azure environment. If you need to have kind of that typical, domain join experience for servers, or if you've got other applications that use LDAP or something, you could provision Azure AD domain services as a way to provide that without actually having a server. So again, if you're less than 25 users, yes, it's very realistic to not have any servers at all. If you're 25 to 50 users, we are still seeing that a server is handy, or it's helpful. Again, for those environments, it's handy to have an administrative point for your IT team or your IT partner. That on-premise domain controller is helpful. Maybe print sharing. Maybe you've got media files on a NAS that you want to manage access through. So all of those things, it's still handy to have a server. A server still doesn't actually cost that much. So that's what we're often seeing is that an organization, that may have had a virtual server with 4 or 5 guests. That's actually now just going to a single server, one role, very straightforward. So you kind of get the benefits of the performance and also have some cost savings as well. As you move up, 50 to 200 users is kind of the next breakdown. You probably still have a need for multiple server roles. You could run that in your environment. You could run that in Azure. But we are still seeing, again, organizations have some stuff on-prem because, typically there's some sunk costs. They have a server room. They've got, this kind of, legacy environment. And so, maybe they'll buy a, single physical server for $10,000 to $15,000, have a bunch of VMs on it, and take that, as opposed to just putting that all in Azure because, the cost does add up, and there's some other benefits in the cloud. So typically we'll have some on-prem gear, but then also have maybe a redundant domain controller, an actual domain controller in Azure. Maybe have some specialized applications that need servers. Maybe that's going to be hosted in Azure as well. And then if you're 200 up, 1,000, again, you're probably still looking at some physical equipment on-prem, a lot of cloud services. Maybe you're not just in Azure. Maybe you've got some resources on Amazon. Maybe you've got some stuff in Google. Maybe you've got some stuff in SoftLayer. But there's a couple of different things that you could have. So again, that's a kind of a typical design scenario that we see for a network. So I did want to, so as I've been talking, I have been chatting out the links to these things along the way. So we've got the Microsoft announcement that said, hey, end of support is coming. No more security patches, please upgrade. Talked about how to migrate from a 2008 R2 domain into 2016. Again, that's pretty straightforward. If you do have 2019, you're gonna need to make some changes to your environment before you can finish that promotion. Had the link there for support in Azure. So again, if it's not realistic for you to migrate a workload into a new platform or do an upgrade or migrate servers to something that would be supported, Server 2016, SQL 2016, you can look at migrating that workload into Azure where you can continue to get support for it. And that would be, again, another 3 years of security updates. You can check that out, that article from Network World. If you do have any questions or wanted to clarify some things around the whole upgrade process and Microsoft's end-of-life announcement, please feel free to go ahead and schedule some time with me. So my calendar information is available here, so you can be happy to schedule a quick call to talk about your specific requirements, to see what we could do to help you map out that migration. We've talked a lot about servers because I think there's a lot more nuance and potential vendor requirements there. Ideally, if you're still holding on to some of those Windows 7 workstations, you would just budget and plan and do kind of a replacement for Windows 10 computers. Maybe you want to use this as an opportunity to add some Macs into your environment. It's a good time to plan for replacement. And I think both OS X or Windows 10 are going to be a lot more secure and robust platforms to work on than trying to hobble along with Windows 7 or even try to do an upgrade of it. All right. Before we wrap up and take some questions, I did want to just highlight our upcoming webinar. So next month, we will be talking about 5 steps to create an information strategy for your organization. That will be on Wednesday, August 21st from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. That will be presented by our partners over at Build Consulting. So they've got a lot of expertise around this area. So I encourage you to sign up, or if that doesn't speak to you, send a sign-up link to somebody who it may interest. And yeah, then finally, just wanted to say, so in terms of next steps, in terms of identifying and planning and kind of figuring out what to do, I think the first step is really having an accurate inventory of those systems. Again, so how many Windows 7 computers do you have that are in production? We look at our list, we know that some significant, maybe not insignificant portion of those Windows 7 computers are, loaners, they're around, they're just kind of hanging out, but maybe they don't represent production. And so our actual numbers of systems are going to be a little bit lower. Again, same thing, for the server environment, what is actually production? What do you need to have up to date versus what, is just kind of hanging around because you haven't got a chance to decommission it. So develop that accurate inventory so you kind of know what you're working with. Once you have an inventory of both the server OS level and the application layer, then you can develop a more accurate plan on what needs to be replaced, what needs to be migrated, and then kind of build your roadmap from there. You got to kind of start from a good foundation, and so then you have an idea of what you're going to replace or migrate, and then you can move on to your implementation phase. So again, 6 months from 2 days ago or 3 days ago is when you got to get stuff done by. And so if you're an organization that still has a big chunk of Windows servers, you probably have a lot of process and policy to go through to kind of figure out what to do with them. And while, they're not going to stop working, on January 21st, it does represent, I think, an increasing and significant security risk just to have systems that can't be patched to known vulnerabilities. And then I think it represents a performance issue. So 2008, was originally, deployed, I think, or released in October of 2009. So that technology is 10 years old at this point. And so, with the pace of technology change and innovation, a lot has changed in 10 years. And so if your organization is still relying on old technology to operate, you may not be able to take advantage of the opportunities as quickly as an organization, that's invested in newer technology or newer platforms. So figure out what your implementation roadmap is and, take action from there. Again, my information is in here, so you can schedule some time to talk with me. I'd be happy to chat. We can talk about some of the options for your organization. So if there's no additional questions, I want to thank everybody for your time. We enjoy doing these webinars, so please provide feedback. We want to make them useful and make them valuable for everyone who's attending. Again, as I mentioned, this is recorded. This will be provided to all the attendees or registrants, and then the slides will also be up on our SlideShare channel. So thank you very much for your time and attention today, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks. Have a great day.